Welcome to part 2 of the Saguina Grove by Barbara Elaine Sanders, published in 1981. When we left off, I was reading to you about the preparations for the meeting with the officials of the United States government with the Indians in Saginaw, where the Treaty of 1819 was to take away significant amount of Native American lands, screwing the Native Americans yet once again. But anyways, that was my commentary. Let's continue with the Treaty Council setting. Although the council hall was a crude structure as compared with more modern architectural designs, in its setting it captured the tranquil grace and beauty of nature. The Honorable Ephraim S. Williams of Saginaw and Flint, in an article published in 1884, preferred to compare it with the temple described by William Cullen Bryant in the opening of his poem, Forest Hymn. And that says, "The groves were God's first temples ere man learned to hew the shaft and lay the architrave, and spread the roof above them ere he framed the lofty vault to gather and roll back the sound of the anthems." This beautiful scene was recorded on canvas in an artistical rendering by the Saginaw artist William John von Shipman, historically researched and produced in 1976. The painting now hangs in the foyer of the Gothic-style Waterworks building located on Ezra Rust Drive, opposite the Grove, and may be viewed by the public. The treaty is the most historically accurate pictorial account of the proceedings yet to be produced. In this wilderness setting, then, began to congregate from 1,500 to 4,000 Indians, the exact number never having been determined. Wigwams were pitched around and near Campo's clearing. Although all the Indian participants had not yet arrived, Governor Cass was ready to commence negotiations. Governor Cass wanted his mission to be successful. After all, he had personal and professional reasons for achieving his goal of successfully negotiating a treaty with the Indians. An examination in retrospect of Lewis Cass, the man and the politician, reveals the motivating factors behind his acts and accomplishments, not only as they relate to the 1819 treaty, but also to his achievements throughout his lifetime. A great deal of divergent opinion has been offered regarding his character and deeds. In 1816, Lewis Cass was described by an Ohioan as a political rascal. According to his father, he even changed political philosophy and association not out of true belief in the other party's principles, but because that which he assumed was more popular. Whether Cass was an opportunist or a realist, his ambition helped him gain later in his lifetime the position of the Secretary of War, United States Senator, and Secretary of State. His lifetime ambition to be president might have been fulfilled had he not lost by popular vote his bid for the presidency in 1848. It is possible that he could have won the popular vote in 1844, but he was unable to win his party's nomination as a candidate. Yet most assessors of his character indicate that Cass was an extremely honest and moral person. Stephen A. Douglas, the black slavery abolitionist, wrote that Cass was a notable patriot and model of a man who could not be governed by higher, purer powers. Charles C. Trowbridge, an intimate friend, once revealed that Cass was scrupulously honest to the last penny. Cass also had a reputation of being scholarly. Although he never earned an academic degree, he was provided a traditional education in the classics during his 7 years at Exeter, a school for boys in New Hampshire, which influenced his thinking and his direction. Much of his knowledge, however, was derived from an insatiable thirst for reading. Habitually, he would take several books on trips with him. His moments of relaxation were spent with them. Consequently, his intellectual endeavors were translated into many of his achievements. Because he had acquired a wide scope of interest, he contributed to the various fields of human endeavor. It was Lewis Cass who suggested for the state of Michigan the motto, Sequeris Peninsulam Ammonem Circumspice. If you seek a beautiful peninsula, look around you, and who designed the official state seal. The original Historical Society of the State of Michigan was founded by Cass. Articles written by Cass were published in periodicals of respected consequences. Included in these contributions is a detailed account of the Battle of New Orleans, which American troops commanded by Andrew Jackson fought and won in January 1815 from the British. From his experiences, contacts, and interests in France, Cass had collected enough information to author books on French history and government. Walter Stevens in Michigan History noted that Cass contributed greatly to future intellectual inquiry by his unremitting insistence upon the collection and preservation of documents, papers, and primary data relating to American history. Collections of his personal notes indicate that Cass had interest which exceeded the parameters of topics of political nature. Notes on astronomy, evolution, the creation of the universe, and a poem penned by Cass may be found. There is a record of a sage address on the topic of education which he presented to the Kalamazoo County Agricultural Society. Several honorary degrees were conferred on Cass, including the LL.D. in 1836 from Harvard University. In 1860, he donated a city block of his property in Detroit to the Detroit Board of Education for the purpose of providing a site for a second high school. When he died in 1866, his personal library of 1,154 volumes was donated to the Detroit Public Library. In spite of some controversy regarding his character, Cass was reputed to be especially skilled in human relations and was compassionate of mankind. As a scholar of Indian culture and negotiator of Indian treaties, Cass came to understand Indian ways sufficiently enough that he sought to defend their existence in spite of expansionist policies of the national government. His direct contact and extensive association with the Indians resulted in their esteem and affection for him. Cass did not consider the Indians as being equal to the white man, which may be supported by the working arrangement provided for Cass and the Chippewas at the 1819 negotiations of the Saginaw Treaty, but respected their society and sought to deal with them in a just manner. Cass believed that by removing the Indian to the west of the Mississippi, they would be provided ample compensation for their lands, which the white man acquired to the east of that great river. American expansionism could not be harnessed, and Cass knew that the culture of the white man could not be mixed with that of the Indian. In the West, the Indians could maintain their culture apart from the white man and would be able to exist as before. Thinking himself to be a protector of the Indians, Cass even sought to remove the availability of alcoholic spirits for their consumption. Cass was reputed to be a non-drinker. In 1833, he delivered an address on temperance to the House of Representatives and subsequently was elected president of the newly formed Congressional Temperance Society. At formal banquets, he would drink a toast with water instead of the customary wine. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., in his book The Age of Jackson, described Cass in regard to his drinking habits by writing the following: "A temperance man, he would yet sit at Washington banquets with wine before him, and every few minutes raise his glass to his lips, going elaborately through the motions, but not actually drinking." With regard to the Indians, Cass certainly believed that alcohol led to the debauchery of their very being, an opinion which held steadfastly throughout scores of years. Lewis Cass indeed contributed significantly to mankind. He was an achiever who set his sights, however, on improving his own status, and travailed almost incessantly in that direction. His formal and informal education, which provided him a firm background upon which to develop and diversify his interests and involvement in a wide range of activities, his motivation for progressive career mobility, and perhaps a rather large ego which provided him the impetus for his subsequent deeds, helped him attain his goals, all except one, the presidency. Of course, the fact that he knew certain people in high places also helped. One of these was James Monroe, 5th President of the United States, who in part allowed Cass to become the master architect of Indian policy. So at age 36, Lewis Cass was in the process of seriously launching his noted career. He was on his way to national prominence. What was soon to be accomplished at Saguina would contribute significantly to his recognition as a leader of national stature. Anticipating possible repercussions brought about by the unkempt governmental promises made in previous agreements, yet another preparatory step was included in the governor's strategy for the successful conclusion of a pact with the Chippewas. Per a stipulation in the 1807 Treaty of Detroit, the United States agreed to pay the Chippewas the amount of $1,666.66 and 6 mills, but he had neglected to fulfill its obligation. Expecting that the Chippewas might not agree to another treaty if the government had not kept a promise made in a previous commitment, Governor Cass took it upon himself to procure from a local bank in Detroit the sum in silver which was owed to the Indians. In September 1819, before leaving Detroit, Cass wrote to the Secretary of War in Washington, so informed him of the bank loan, and requested that the government forward a bank draft to repay what had been borrowed. It was to be seen later that the dispensation of this same fund, which Cass was taking to Saguina, would cause considerable consternation among certain traders and would lead to placing the governor and the other white men in a very tenuous position with the Indians. All of the total number of Indians who were eventually present at the great meeting as yet had not arrived for the talks. However, there was a very respectable representation of them already assembled, which greatly exceeded in actual number and ratio those 50 or 60 white men who counted among the governor's party and the fur traders who also were present at the gathering in order to do a little business for themselves. Even considering the company of soldiers which was there to protect the white men and to ensure the orderly conduct of negotiations might occur, the whites were far outnumbered. Among the Indians was the infamous chief Kishkauko, a violent man whose hatred for the whites had been repeatedly expressed with acts of physical and mental brutality. Kishkauko had the habit of going south from Saguina and raiding white settlements, particularly in the Detroit area. As a younger man, he was a primary figure involved in the kidnapping of a white boy. According to the story, Kishkauko had a younger brother who died soon after the end of the Revolutionary War. His mother's grief was so great that she asked her husband to find a replacement son for her. In the company of a raiding party, Kishkauko and his father left for the Ohio River region, where they snatched the 10-year-old son of Reverend John Tanner. The young boy, who was given the Indian name Greyhawk, spent 2 years with the Chippewas, during which time he was treated with an array of abuses. So that he would have no desire to return to his own family, he was also given the erroneous information that his family had been killed by the Indians. Greyhawk's mental anguish and sorrow must have seemed insurmountable. Without apparent recourse, he stayed at Saguina until he was eventually sold to the Ottawa woman who had also lost a son in death. After remaining with the Indians for 3 decades, Greyhawk one day returned to Ohio, where he found his brothers and learned that his mother and father had died, but not as he had been told so many years before. Now accustomed to the Indian ways in which he had been raised and had passed most of his life, Greyhawk returned to Sault Ste. Marie to spend the rest of his life, which, compared to that of his parents had intended for him, had been virtually ruined by Kishkauko and his associates. Kishkauko was the subject of the first legal warrant for an Indian issued at Detroit for the stabbing murder of a white man. He was to be tried in the territorial Supreme Court, but with the help of other Indians, managed to escape captivity, and he was being taken prisoner. Thereafter, Kishkauko continued his criminal activities against the white man, and even indulged in certain ludicrous antics outside the grounds of Fort Saginaw during the short term of its occupation by American troops from 1822 to 1823. Several years after his harassment of Fort Saginaw, Kishkauko was in jail in Detroit awaiting his own execution by hanging for the murder of a white man on the St. Clair River. According to reports, a retinue of Indians from Saguina, which included his 4 wives, received permission to visit him in jail one day before the death sentence was scheduled to occur. One of the wives managed to slip him a poisonous vegetable concoction, which he took rather than submit to the ultimate punishment which the white man had conferred upon him. The next morning, Kishkauko was found dead in his cell. he had ended his own life, and having spent most of his life engaged in murderous inclinations against the white man, there was no indication that such an event might not happen at the 1819 treaty talks. At the opening of the negotiations, Kishkako and two other respected Chippewa chiefs, oh my goodness, Mishheninoquet and Ogee-Maw-Kee-Kee-Tu, acted as speakers for the Indians. On September 11th at 10 o'clock in the morning, Governor Cass held the first council. From his elevated platform, the governor spoke to the Indians who were seated on the logs about him. Two fur traders, Whittemore Knaggs and Henry Connor, who were known to the Indians and could speak their language, interpreted the message which Cass was delivering. Referring to the president as the great white father in Washington, Cass told the Indians that the government was concerned about their welfare because the wild game was becoming scarce and that they wanted to move the Indians west of the Mississippi River where they could manage their sustenance for life by growing crops for food. To these Indians, who were so accustomed to maintaining their lives from hunting, conversion of their existence to an agriculture basis would be extremely difficult, if not even impossible. The Indians astutely understood their capabilities and made it known that the governor's proposal was quite undesirable. Ogee-Maw-Kee-Kee-Tu, a young man of not more than 21 years who came from what is now Midland, eloquently indicated that the Indians' indignation at and opposition. Cass retorted to what he perceived as the chief's arrogance by saying that because the English king had just lost a war to the American government and thereby had forfeited the Indian lands to the Americans, the territory which Cass was trying to negotiate essentially belonged to the United States already. And perhaps it was Governor Cass who was being arrogant. On this note, the first council ended and the Indians and the white men retired to their respective lodgings. Kishkako proceeded to drink himself into a state of prolonged inebriety, and thankfully so remained tranquilly incapacitated for most of the rest of the great meeting. For several days negotiations remained at an impasse until Cass offered the Indians a less demanding proposition. Through interpreters, the Indians were informed that they would be permitted to hunt in their forest if they would sign the agreement which Cass so intensely desired to reach. However, it was a behind-the-scenes intrigue that finally caused the treaty to be successfully concluded. Per the 1807 treaty, the southerly border of the Indian lands was a line drawn near the location of the Flint River. The territory along that border was occupied by the aging chief Naomi, whose band of Indians was one of the largest among the Chippewas. Naomi was a kind and sincere man who was of nature that permitted him to be persuaded by appeals to his sense of gratitude and goodness. Because of the size of the band of which he was leader and because of the strategic location of the 40,000 acres which Naomi's band occupied, Naomi was a power to be reckoned with. His opposition or approval of the treaty would determine the outcome of the governor's efforts. An Indian trader named Jacob Smith was to be the missing link which would join the two factions. The Indians called him Wa-Bisons, or the Young Swan. He was a white man who had a family in Detroit where Governor Cass knew him personally. Cass did not particularly like or trust him, but among the Indians he had been accepted as one of their own. Before the War of 1812, Jacob Smith became an Indian trader and spent considerable time among the Indians of the Saginaw Valley. He established a permanent trading post near the Grand Traverse of the Flint River, from which he set out to trade with the Indians throughout the area. Although he did not reside within the confines of the Chippewa territory, he had located himself near Naomi's village, where he came to know the old chief and became as close to him as a brother. Wa-Bisons took an Indian wife and raised a family by her. After having lived among the Indians for so long a time, he acquired their language, manner of dress, and other cultural habits. He was a small man in height and weight whose lithe body could stealthily penetrate the silence of the forest. On many occasions he had helped the Indians in a time of need and had extended his friendship to them. He thought and behaved like an Indian, and for those things Wa-Bisons was respected. At the 1819 treaty negotiations, Jacob Smith had no official position either with the Indians or the white men, but his presence soon became quite evident. at the conclusion of the first council negotiations remained in deadlock. Through informal talks back and forth, Cass had begun to retreat from his original demands by agreeing to allow the Indians to remain on certain sections of land reserved for their exclusive use within the territory which they currently occupied. One night in Naomi's tent, the chief and Wabisons were talking about the treaty and its probable effect on the Indians. Although tracts of land were to be reserved for the bands of Indians, Naomi was concerned that there would be no future home specifically designated for his children. In this matter, he asked Wabisons to help him, and Wabisons placed the names of 11 Indian children on a piece of paper. About 4 of these names belonged to Naomi's offspring. It is quite probable that many, if not all of the remaining 7, were children born to Wabisons and a probable assortment of Indian women. Apparently, Mr. Smith was adept at producing children, as was the assimilating to the Indian culture. Nevertheless, the paper on which the 11 names were written was presented along with a request to reserve 640 acres for each person therein named. Whittemore Knaggs, who with other agents had assumed the role of spokesman for the government outside the formal sessions, promised that the lands requested as individual reserves would be provided in the treaty. At this point, the stalemate essentially ended, and another council was called. All the chiefs and warriors were present at the second council. In an orderly, progressive manner, open discussion was held regarding the terms to which all parties could agree. At the third and final council, 114 chiefs affixed their totems with the signature of the Governor Cass and witnesses to the treaty which succeeded to the United States government some 6 million acres of virgin land, rich in forest, animals, waters, and heritage, which would be diminished to the point of near annihilation. The names of the chiefs who agreed to the contract are contained in the following list. The names of those who witnessed the signing of the document also appear herein, and there is the extensive listing of names, and I'm not going to read those. But when we start with part 3 next, we will actually read the Treaty of 1819 and see exactly what was in it and exactly how the Native Americans who had inhabited what was Michigan for well over 6,000 years actually were kind of screwed out of it by the government of the United States and its representatives. So I ask you to please come back for part 3.